My name is Paige Mercer, and I was 25 the night my parents took me to dinner to tell me I was adopted. My mother smiled as she explained that they had only kept me for the benefits, and now that I was no longer useful, they didn't need me anymore. My father quietly slid the paperwork across the tablecloth. They had already filed everything necessary to remove me from their future plans. I didn't cry. I didn't speak a single word for nearly a minute. But here's what neither of them knew. 6 months before that dinner, I had found my birth family. And that night, I had seated them 3 tables behind my mother's chair. She simply hadn't turned around yet. What happened when she finally did is the reason I'm sitting here 6 years later telling you the story. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we share quiet, true-to-life family stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stopped shrinking themselves to fit into a seat they were never truly offered. If you've ever had to earn your place at your own family's table, this story is for you. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. The restaurant was called Van Ter, and I had never been taken there before in my life. My mother chose it. That should have been my first clue, because Diane Mercer never spent money on me without a reason that could be traced somewhere on the receipt. She wore the gray cashmere sweater she reserved for funerals and board meetings. My father, Wesley, had booked the reservation under her name, not mine, which I noticed when the hostess asked and he answered before I had the chance. There was no banner, no balloon tied to my chair, no cake waiting in the kitchen with my name written in blue icing. For a birthday dinner, the table felt strangely empty, and the air between my parents carried the careful politeness of people preparing to deliver a verdict. I had spent 4 years sitting in rooms exactly like this. I booked tables like this for clients, signings, and the quiet conversations families have when someone dies and the money begins to move. I knew the difference between a dinner and a deposition. And this had the atmosphere of a deposition. So I did what I always do when a room turns cold. I focused on my breathing and counted the exits. That's when I noticed the small brass numbers standing on the table behind us and slightly to the left. Table 9. I fixed it in my memory without fully understanding why. The way you notice a landmark before realizing you'll eventually need it to find your way back. I placed my own item beside my water glass. A thin manila folder. Plain. Ordinary. My mother glanced at it and assumed it was a resume or perhaps a birthday card. She had no idea what was inside. To understand why none of this surprised me, you have to understand what birthdays look like in our house. When I was little, my birthday was one candle. Not one candle as a family tradition. Not a single decorative number candle. Just one candle pushed into a grocery store cupcake my mother picked up on the drive home and never bothered to refrigerate. I'd watch it sweat on the counter while she finished a phone call. 3 weeks later, my cousin Brett would have a rented bounce house and catered food served on silver trays because Brett was my Aunt Renee's son. And Brett was blood. I remember asking for a party when I turned 8. My aunt was visiting and drinking my mother's wine. She answered before my mother could. "We can only afford one nice thing a month, honey." She said it kindly. That was the part that taught me the most. How gentle people can sound while explaining exactly where you rank. So I learned the math. One cupcake costs less than a party. A child who asks for less is cheaper than a child who asks for equal treatment. By 9 years old, I had stopped asking for cake because I could see it made the calculations easier for everyone involved. And being easy felt like the only currency I possessed. I never told myself it was sad. I told myself it was practical. That's the thing about growing up useful. You don't realize you've been assigned a price until someone eventually says the number aloud. And sitting across from my mother at Van Ter, 25 years old, I could feel her preparing to say it. I left that house the week I turned 18 with 2 duffel bags and a community college acceptance letter that I had completed myself. Nobody drove me there. I worked nights at a pharmacy counter and attended classes in the morning. Later, I transferred to a state university and completed a paralegal program while waiting tables on weekends. I paid for every bit of it. I want to be clear about that, not because it makes me extraordinary, but because it matters later. Nobody handed me anything. By 25, I was a paralegal at a trust and estates firm downtown, and I was good at my job. I spent my days inside other people's wealth, organizing what happens to a person's life after they can no longer manage it themselves. I drafted the boring pages that decide everything. beneficiary designations, distribution schedules, the quiet legal language that determines who receives what long after the funeral flowers fade. I could read a trust the way some people read facial expressions. And the irony of my life, the one I didn't find funny for years, was this: I could create perfect boundaries for complete strangers. I could explain exactly what a grieving widow was entitled to and exactly what she wasn't. But I could not make my own family want me. The only person I ever called consistently was my grandmother. Every Sunday at 4 o'clock sharp. Like clockwork. All through college and beyond. Nana Ruth. She was the only Mercer who answered the phone as if she'd been waiting for it to ring. And something Nana once told me became the hinge upon which that entire night would eventually turn. Nana Ruth Mercer was my father's mother. She was the only adult in that family who ever treated me like a person instead of an expense. She had opinions about everything and regrets about nothing. When I was 12 and crying in her kitchen because Brett had told me I wasn't a real Mercer, she set down her dish towel, lifted my chin, and spoke the sentence I carried with me for the next 13 years. You were chosen, sweetheart, not collected. Then she made me a grilled cheese sandwich and let me stay awake far past bedtime. Nana passed away when I was 23, 2 years before that dinner. At her funeral, I delivered the only eulogy that talked about who she had been instead of what she left behind. Within a month, my parents quietly moved out of their cramped split-level home and into the larger house on Linden Road. The house that had been connected to Nana's name for years. The house whose significance I understood far better than they realized. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I was grieving. But during one of our final Sunday phone calls, Nana had said something I stored away without understanding. I made sure. That was all she said before adding, "You'll never have to ask anyone for your own life." I thought she meant it as encouragement. A grandmother reminding her granddaughter to stay strong. It would take until 6 months before that dinner, while reviewing county records for an unrelated matter, for me to discover that she had meant it literally. In writing. Signed and notarized. The year before I turned 25, my family started becoming quiet around me. And not the comfortable kind of quiet. Messages that once received replies within an hour suddenly took 3 days. My mother stopped including me in holiday planning conversations. Then she acted surprised whenever I mentioned feeling left out. When I showed up to Thanksgiving without a side dish nobody had actually asked me to bring. My Aunt Renee, meanwhile, got louder. She had started using a word in the family group chat that she'd never bothered using before. Blood. As in, this is a blood-only weekend at the lake. As in, the cabin only sleeps 8 and we'd like to keep it to blood this year. You understand. I understood. I understood perfectly. I just didn't have the documents yet to explain why the temperature had dropped so suddenly, all at once, during the exact same season. People don't usually turn cold on a schedule. Families drift apart, sure. But this wasn't drift. This was coordinated. And the analytical part of my brain kept flagging it. The way you notice 3 unrelated invoices arriving on the same Tuesday and suddenly realize they aren't unrelated at all. So when my phone lit up one evening in March with my mother's name and a voice 3 degrees warmer than it had been in over a year, I didn't feel flattered. I felt the small cold click of a lock turning somewhere I couldn't see. "Honey," she said. And she only called me honey when she wanted something. "We'd like to take you out and celebrate 25 properly. The way we never quite managed before." And every instinct I had developed from 4 years of reading other people's bad news told me the same thing. This is too neat. Here's what most people misunderstand about my mother. They think the cruelty is loud. It isn't. The cruelty is the preparation. The cruelty is a woman who never managed to provide a proper birthday cake, suddenly reserving a corner table at Van Ter and calling it celebrating you properly. When Diane becomes generous, it's because a spreadsheet somewhere has already informed her that the generosity will pay for itself. I'd watched it happen my entire life. I just had never been the line item before. So I said yes. Sweetly. Exactly the way she'd taught me to. Then I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long time doing what I always do. I thought about timelines. I thought about the house on Linden Road. I thought about the word blood appearing in the group chat at precisely this moment, during precisely this season. And I thought about a sentence my grandmother had spoken before she died. I also thought about the manila folder already sitting in my work bag. The one I'd assembled 6 months earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother, and everything to do with finally discovering where I came from. I didn't call my parents back to ask questions. I didn't warn them that I'd been to the county clerk's office. Instead, I made a few calls of my own. Quiet calls. The kind you make when you've decided you're not going to be ambushed. You're going to be prepared. I won't tell you yet who I called, but I will tell you the rule I live by. The one Nana never spoke aloud but taught me anyway. When my mother becomes sweet, someone at the table is about to lose something. I simply made sure this time it wouldn't be me. People assume a story like this is about money, and I understand why. There's a will somewhere. A house. A folder sliding across a table. But sitting in my car in the Vanterre parking lot that night, engine off, hands steady on the steering wheel, the thing I feared losing had no dollar value at all. I was afraid of losing the last belief that I had ever truly belonged anywhere. Because as cold as that house had been, as transactional as every candle and every casserole, it was still the only origin story I had. They were still, technically, my parents. And if they cut that thread tonight the way I suspected they intended to, then I would become exactly what Brett had called me when I was 12. Not a real Mercer. Just a girl somebody picked up and eventually put down. That's the wound they were aiming for. And they knew it because it was the wound they'd pressed on my entire life. What they never accounted for was that the wound had already healed. 6 months can do that when the right people find you. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, tucked the folder beneath my arm, and crossed the parking lot with the particular calm of a woman who has already read the final page of a book everyone else believes is still being written. I wasn't walking into a disownment. I was walking into a goodbye I had already chosen. They just didn't know it yet. We ordered drinks before anyone said a single true thing. My mother complimented the wine list. My father retold a parking story he'd already shared in the car. And then somewhere between the bread course and the oat race nobody would eventually eat, Diane folded her hands and slipped into the voice. I know that voice. It's the same one she used when she returned a Christmas gift in front of me and carefully explained why it hadn't been practical. We've always done our very best for you, she began. Wesley nodded half a second behind her, the same way he'd been nodding behind her for 30 years. We gave you a roof. An education. More than some children ever receive. I let her speak. I rested one hand flat against the manila folder beside my plate and watched my father's eyes flick down toward it and then away. The folder had a label on the tab. Typed. Only the top edge visible above my fingers. If he looked closely, he could make out 4 letters. And he looked twice. I covered the rest with my thumb. Not to hide it. Just to let him wonder. And I watched the wondering begin to work on him. My mother continued talking about sacrifices. About how a child should understand the cost of being raised. And I thought about a sweating cupcake. 1 candle. And I said nothing. Then she paused. Took a careful sip. Set her glass down with the precision of a woman arriving at a slide she had rehearsed. And then she delivered the sentence that opened the door to everything. There's something, Paige, that you should have been told a very long time ago. You're adopted. My mother said it the same way someone might announce a change in a dinner reservation. We adopted you when you were an infant. You were never biologically ours. I want you to know we never intended to keep this from you forever. She watched my face as she spoke, and I understood that she was waiting for the collapse. This was the moment she'd designed the entire evening around. The corner table. The cashmere sweater. The carefully timed pauses. Every detail engineered to arrive right here. At the exact second her adopted daughter discovered she'd been a stranger all along and shattered into pieces they could sweep aside and leave behind. I'd love to tell you it didn't land. It did. Some part of every person still expects the floor to be there. And mine had just been informed there was no floor. But I'd already had 6 months to learn this truth. And the only thing my mother actually revealed that night was how little she understood me. She leaned forward, almost gentle, and delivered the sentence I will hear in waiting rooms and quiet kitchens for the rest of my life. We only kept you for the benefits. She smiled when she said it. That was the detail that finally freed me. Not the cruelty. I'd been raised on cruelty. The smile. A woman does not smile while delivering the worst news of your life, unless she has rehearsed it enough times to enjoy the performance. And in that smile, I finally saw the entire shape of it. I hadn't been a daughter who disappointed them. I had been an asset that had finished depreciating. Benefits is a clean word for a dirty arrangement. And my father, to his lasting discredit, tried to explain it the way an accountant defends a questionable tax decision. There were assistance payments in the early years, Wesley said, avoiding my eyes. The adoption came with a small monthly subsidy when you were little, but that ended a long time ago, back when you were still in grade school. After that, there were tax advantages. And then there was your grandmother, of course. Though he didn't say Nana's name that way. He explained that Nana had certain expectations about family, that adopting me had helped them satisfy those expectations, and that satisfying them had proven to be, in his careful accountant's wording, worthwhile for many years. I sat perfectly still and allowed the arithmetic of my childhood to rearrange itself into its true equation. The single cupcake. The hand-me-down clothes from Brett that still carried tags from Renee's returns. The way the thermostat always seemed to drop first in my room. They hadn't been poor. They had simply been keeping the difference between what a child costs and what a child generates. And I had been the generator. We invested in you, Wesley said, as if that settled the matter. As if a child were a rental property with a depreciation schedule. Then my mother, impatient with his accounting lecture, cut directly to the line beneath all the others. The one the entire evening had been designed to deliver. The subsidy has been gone since you were a child, Paige. And what came after it ends today. You're 25 now. There's simply nothing further that keeping you does for us. She said it almost regretfully, the way someone might mention that a coupon had expired. Now you're not useful. 2 sentences. And they had reduced a quarter-century of me being their daughter into a line item that had stopped producing returns. I reached for my water. My hand didn't shake. I noticed that it didn't, and I filed that away as a small and unexpected gift. Then my father did the thing he had come there to do. He reached into the leather portfolio he'd brought, the one I'd assumed contained a birthday card, and slid a thin stack of papers across the tablecloth until it touched my plate. We've already filed, he said, to formalize things. You won't be included in the will. You won't be a beneficiary of anything we own. We wanted to handle this cleanly in person, so there wouldn't be any confusion later. He had rehearsed the word cleanly. I could hear the attorney who had coached him through it. And here's the part my family has never been able to understand. The part that changed the entire evening for me without my saying a single word. I read the caption on the first page in about 4 seconds. The same way I'd read thousands of them before. And immediately I saw what they had done. They had filed against the wrong instrument. They had spent good money cutting me out of an estate that was almost irrelevant while leaving untouched the document that actually controlled everything. They didn't know what I knew. They believed the power in that room flowed through their modest will. And so that's where they'd aimed their expensive little knife. I didn't correct them. You don't tell the opposing side they've sued the wrong defendant. You let them finish. So I slid the papers an inch back toward the center of the table, neither accepting nor rejecting them. And I let them continue believing they'd already won. Across the table, my Aunt Renee's voice suddenly arrived through speakerphone from my mother's purse because, of course, Renee was listening. Because Renee had helped architect half of this. Blood looks after blood, Paige, she said. Warm as a knife sinking into soup. You've always understood that. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. Part of me had expected to. Some 12-year-old version of myself still living in my chest had been bracing for this exact table since the night Brett told her she wasn't real. But 25-year-old me simply took a slow sip of water and set the glass down without making a sound. And I watched something cross my mother's face that I had genuinely never seen before. Disappointment. Not in me. In the performance. She had written this scene with a sobbing girl in the starring role. And the girl wasn't sobbing. Which was ruining her ending. Aren't you going to say anything? She asked. There was an edge in her voice now. The brittleness of a woman whose script had gone off the rails. I considered the question. I considered everything I could have said. The entire flood of it. 25 years backed up behind one small dam. And then she made the mistake people like her always make. She filled the silence by reaching for the line that had worked the first time, expecting it to work again. We only kept you for the benefits, she repeated. slower this time, leaning on every word, trying to draw blood she could actually see. But a sentence loses its teeth the second time you hear it from the same mouth. The first time it had been a revelation. The second time it was simply a confession. And not a confession about me. It told me everything about her and absolutely nothing about my worth. I adjusted the napkin in my lap, smoothed it once, and let her watch me refuse to break. Behind her, at table 9, I saw a woman with my exact chin turn her head toward our table and go completely still. To explain what was inside my folder, I need to take you back 6 months to the week 2 envelopes arrived and changed the arithmetic of my entire life. The first envelope was one I'd been waiting for. After Nana died, I finally registered with the State Adoption Reunion Registry, half convinced nothing would come from it. 8 weeks later, a letter arrived in handwriting I didn't recognize. Careful. Looping. The handwriting of a woman who had practiced what she wanted to say. It was from Susan Hill. She wrote that she had been 19 when she gave me up. That she had never wanted to. That she had thought about me every March for 25 years. And that if I ever wanted to meet her, she would drive any distance, any day, with no expectations attached. She signed her name. Then beneath it, she added one final line. The line I read so many times the paper eventually softened at the folds. I never stopped saving you a seat. The second envelope arrived 3 days later. And it had nothing to do with Susan. Or so I believed. Our state had only recently opened original birth records to adult adoptees, available once you turned 21 and filed through the same reunion registry. I submitted my request the same week Susan's letter arrived. While I was already in the county system waiting for those records, I requested the file for Nana's estate. Professional habit. The way a dentist notices strangers' teeth. And there it was. Buried inside the distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust. Executed 2 years before her death. Administered not by my parents, but by a bank. The caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter Paige. Not their estate. Hers. Held by a trustee they couldn't control. Scheduled to leave their hands forever on the exact date they had chosen for that dinner. 2 envelopes in 1 week. One told me where I came from. The other told me in my grandmother's signed and notarized handwriting exactly what my parents were about to lose and why they had suddenly become so eager. I did not call my mother and scream the discovery into the phone. That's not the weapon I had. And it's not the weapon I trust. I've watched too many families lose everything because of a satisfying outburst that an attorney later turns into evidence. What I had was process. So I used process. I took a personal day, drove the trust documents to an estate attorney with no connection whatsoever to my family, and paid her from my own savings to confirm what I already suspected. The caregiver distributions were legitimate. They were ongoing. And they were ending. My parents had been receiving a monthly sum for raising me and living in the house funded by the trust for the better part of 2 decades. The remainder, on my 25th birthday, transferred to me under the trust's own terms through a corporate trustee, with nothing my parents could file, sign, or shred capable of stopping it. Their will had nothing to do with it. Their disownment was theater being performed on the wrong stage. My attorney asked whether I wanted to notify them. Get ahead of it. Soften the landing. I said no. I said I wanted 3 things in a folder, and that was all. The retainer letter, so they'd know I had counsel. The trust's distribution schedule, so they'd see the date in black and white. And my original birth certificate with Susan Hale's name listed on the mother's line, so that when the moment arrived, the table would understand exactly which family I was choosing to leave, and which one I was choosing to keep. I labeled the tab. I closed the folder. I slipped it into my bag, and I carried it for 6 months like a quiet engine I hadn't started yet. The dinner invitation only told me when to turn the key. I met Susan Hale for the first time in a diner halfway between our cities because she didn't want me to have to drive too far. And that small consideration undid me more than any speech ever could. She was nervous. She had brought a photo album she kept opening and closing without showing me, as though she wasn't sure she'd earned the right. She had my chin. She had my habit of going quiet whenever she felt too much. Over 6 months, we built something carefully, the way you'd repair a bridge while standing on it. I learned I had a half-brother named Danny, 20 years old. All elbows and questions. Within a week of meeting me, he was texting memes as if I'd always been there to receive them. I learned my birth grandmother was a small, fierce woman named Pearl who took one look at me and said, "Well, there she is." Like I'd merely been late. Not missing for a quarter century. They never asked me for anything. That was the part my entire nervous system couldn't quite understand. No favors. No money. No role to perform. Susan told me something during our third meeting that became the truest sentence of my life. "We've kept a seat for you, sweetheart," she said. "We never gave it to anyone else." And I, a woman who could draft a flawless beneficiary clause for a stranger who understood the exact legal language of belonging, sat in a vinyl booth and didn't know what to do with my own hands. Because for the first time, I was wanted by people who got absolutely nothing out of wanting me. After 25 years of being useful, I had no idea how to simply be welcome. I was about to learn quickly. There's a difference between being needed and being wanted. And I'd only ever known one of them. Being needed, I understood perfectly. Being needed is a job. You show up. You produce. You stay easy. You keep the math simple. And in exchange, you get to keep your seat for another quarter. I had been needed my entire life. And I'd mistaken the consistency of it for love. The way you can mistake a long commute for a destination simply because you travel it every day. What Susan and Danny and Pearl offered me came with no job attached. And that frightened me more than my mother ever had. The first time Susan called just to ask how my week had been, with no hidden agenda underneath it, I spent the entire conversation waiting for the catch. And when there wasn't one, I had to pull my car over because I couldn't see the road. I kept testing them in small, ungenerous ways I'm not proud of. I'd cancel plans to see whether they'd punish me. They didn't. They'd simply say, "No worries. Next time." And they meant it. I'd insist on paying for everything, trying to make myself useful, trying to earn the seat. Pearl finally took my face in her hands the way Nana used to and said, "You don't have to buy your way in here. We already paid." And slowly, over those 6 months, a knot I'd carried since I was 9 began, not to disappear, but to loosen. I started believing, despite 25 years of evidence to the contrary, that a person could simply want me in the room. So when my mother called to invite me to celebrate 25 properly, I already knew where I wanted to spend that evening. I simply decided to spend it everywhere at once. Here's who I called. The night my mother booked Fanterre, I called Susan and asked her a question I'd been too afraid to ask anyone in my life. "Would you come to my birthday dinner?" I explained the entire situation. The parents. The suspicions. The trust. The speech I could feel coming. I told her I didn't know exactly what they planned to say, but I knew I didn't want to hear it alone. And I knew I no longer wanted to perform the grief they were counting on. Susan didn't hesitate for even a second. "What time and where?" she asked. "And should we dress up?" Then she said something that made me cover my mouth with my hand in my kitchen. "We'd be honored," she said, "to watch you not need them." So I made one more call. This one to Fanterre. And I reserved a second table for that same evening under my own name. Paige Mercer. Party of 3. Table 9, the hostess told me. Near the back. 3 tables behind the reservation, already listed for a Mercer party of 3 near the front. I almost laughed at the geometry of it. They had no idea they would be performing my disownment within sight of the family that had spent 25 years saving me a chair. I told Susan and Pearl and Danny to arrive shortly after us. To order quietly. To simply be there. And to let me come to them when I was ready. I won't pretend I didn't want them in that room. I did. There's a reason truth lands harder when spoken in front of people than when delivered through a letter. And I'd witnessed enough confrontations to know that a private one eventually becomes nothing more than one person's word against another's. So yes, I wanted witnesses. And I'm not ashamed of that. But Susan and Pearl and Danny were never merely witnesses to me. And that was the entire difference between what they were doing and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I'd make my parents understand they'd lost. Table 9 was where I'd go to remember I'd already won long before they sat down. Back at the front table, in the present, my mother decided the silence had lasted long enough and moved to close the deal. She produced one more page from the leather portfolio and turned it toward me, uncapping a pen and placing it across the paper like a small gift. "It's just an acknowledgement," she said, "that we've informed you, that you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a civilized dinner and go our separate ways." I looked at the page. I didn't have to read very far. The release paragraph opened with the exact boilerplate language I'd typed hundreds of times myself. "The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy." And the rest of it did exactly what language like that always does. It wasn't an acknowledgement. It was a waiver disguised as one. A neat little document designed to have me agree, on the record, that I had been notified and possessed no claim. The kind of document a careful attorney drafts to prevent precisely the challenge I was in a position to bring. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding from the revelation, before the shock faded and I had time to think. It's a classic move. I've seen grieving people sign away fortunes at kitchen tables simply because someone slid a pen toward them at exactly the right wounded moment. My mother was counting on my wound. She just didn't know it had a trust attached to it. I left the pen exactly where it lay. Across from me, my father kept glancing at my manila folder, and I watched the worry crawl up his neck like a slow red tide. Wesley had always been the one who knew where the money actually lived. He'd seen the 4 letters on the tab. He was doing the arithmetic now, the same arithmetic I'd done 6 months earlier, and I could tell the answer was beginning to frighten him. "Is there?" He started, then stopped. "Is there something we should know, Paige?" I smiled at him. The first genuine smile of the evening. "Not yet," I said. That was the moment my Aunt Renee arrived in person with Brett trailing behind her. Both of them performing the surprise of people who had clearly been waiting in the bar for a text message. "Paige, what a coincidence," Renee said, pressing a cold cheek against mine. And I immediately understood that Diane had called in reinforcements. My mother liked an audience for her best performances. And she especially liked one that would nod along and apply pressure if I became difficult. Renee pulled up a chair without being invited. Brett, 26 and still dressing like his mother bought his clothes, gave me the same look I'd been receiving since childhood. The look that said you were always destined to end up at the kids' table eventually. Renee got right to work. Subtlety had never been her instrument. "We just want what's best for the family," she said, placing a manicured hand over my mother's. "And families have to make hard choices about who's truly part of them. You've always been such a practical girl, Paige. You understand that blood looks after blood." There it was again. That word. The one she'd been planting throughout the family group chat all year. Finally spoken aloud at the table it had been preparing for. I looked at my aunt, who had answered for my mother the day I turned 8 and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a birthday party. And I felt the final thread of obligation inside me loosen. These were not people I was losing. These were people I was setting down. I'd carried them a very long way, far longer than they deserved. And my arms were finally, gloriously tired. Across the table, my father wasn't joining in. He was staring at his hands. Then, while Renee was in the middle of a sentence about the family's wishes, Wesley leaned slightly toward me and said something quietly. "Just for me. Your grandmother loved you," my father said softly beneath Renee's chatter. Then he stopped. For a moment, I saw the entire alternate version of Wesley Mercer, the one who might have existed if he'd ever chosen a difficult truth over a comfortable lie. His eyes were wet. He had loved his mother. I knew that much was true. And some part of him understood that the woman he loved had built a wall around me with her own money precisely because she didn't trust her son to protect me. That had to be a painful thing to sit with at a dinner table. I waited. I genuinely waited. Because there was a version of that night where my father spoke the next sentence. The apology. The "I'm sorry." The "this is wrong." The "I won't do this." And I would have heard it. And it would have mattered. But he looked at my mother, who was watching him the way a handler watches a dog that has wandered too close to the road. And I saw him choose. He sat back. He picked up his water. And the almost sentence died in his throat, where so many of his almost sentences had died over the years. That was the closest thing to love anyone at the front table offered me all night. And it lasted 4 words and a swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate a man for being exactly the weight you've always known he was. But I finally understood that the reason they'd filed everything in such a hurry, the reason for the entire rushed and cruel evening, was sitting behind his wet eyes. He knew about Nana's trust. He'd known the date was approaching. And he had desperately hoped to get my signature on a waiver before I ever discovered what his mother had done for me. So I asked him a question. Not loudly. Not as a daughter. I asked it in the voice I use at the firm when I've found the flaw in someone's filing and I'm giving them the dignity of noticing it themselves. Dad, I said, which instrument did you file under? Your estate or Nana's trust? The table went quiet in an entirely new way. My mother's wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Renee's manicured hand froze in place. Wesley blinked at me as though I'd suddenly begun speaking a language he half recognized from a country he'd never visited. Because in 8 words, I told them 3 things they hadn't planned for. That I knew there was a difference between the two. That I knew which one actually mattered. And that I'd known long enough to learn the vocabulary perfectly. My mother had never heard me use that voice before. None of them had. To them, I had always been the quiet one. The easy one. The girl who accepted the smaller slice so the table could remain pleasant. They had built this entire evening on the assumption that I would receive my fate. Not audit it. What? My mother asked. And it came out smaller than she intended. What are you talking about? I let the question sit. I've learned that the most powerful person in any room is the one who doesn't need to rush toward the answer. I turned my water glass a quarter turn against the tablecloth, lined it up with the edge of the manila folder, and looked directly at my father, who had gone very pale, who already knew, and who was silently begging me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. I didn't make a spectacle of it. There was no flourish, no slammed documents, no dramatic speech. I simply turned the folder toward them and laid the 3 pages out on the white cloth side by side, the way I'd present exhibits to a client who needed to understand their own situation. The retainer letter first, with the firm's letterhead and the unmistakable language confirming that I was represented by counsel. The distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust second, with the relevant paragraph already highlighted there in black and white for anyone at the table to read. And third, my original birth certificate, with Susan Hale's name where my mother had always assumed her own belonged. I didn't point at anything. I let the paper do the work paper has always done. My mother's eyes went to the trust schedule first. Because of course they did. Because some instinctive part of her had always known where the money slept. I watched her read it. I watched the words settle in. The caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter Paige. I watched her reach the word remainder, then the word Paige, and I watched the color drain from her face from the top down, like a window shade being pulled closed. She looked up at me, then at Wesley, then back down at the page. The way people do when they're hoping a second reading will somehow say something kinder than the first. It didn't. It never does. Mom, I said gently because I could afford to be gentle now. You filed against the wrong family. The one they cut me out of had always been the smaller piece. My mother was quick, I'll give her that much. Even now, it took her barely 10 seconds to assemble the full picture, and I watched it happen on her face in real time. The house on Linden Road, funded by the trust she assumed she would live inside forever. The monthly distributions that had quietly supported her comfort for years, now ending on their own terms that very night. The remainder, the real money, the part she had orbited for 2 decades without ever controlling it, passing on this exact date to the daughter she had just declared finished. And the waiver. Her neat little waiver. The one I had been seconds away from signing, which would have meant nothing at all, because it released claims against an estate that was never where the value actually lived. She had aimed every weapon she owned at a will and completely missed the trust. The cruelty had been free. The mistake had been expensive. And this was the final lesson my mother ever had for me. People like her don't apologize when they're caught. They pivot. Her expression shifted in front of me. The cold drained out, replaced by something warm, practiced, almost rehearsed in its softness. She reached across the table for my hand. Paige, she said, voice suddenly tender in a way I had never once heard when it cost her anything. We're still your parents. Whatever is in those papers doesn't change that. We're family. Family. From the same mouth that 20 minutes earlier had said, "We only kept you for the benefits." I looked at her hand in the air between us. And I didn't take it. That same sentence, once a weapon, now sat in a different light entirely. A confession. One that finally cleared the path for me to leave. People expect this is the moment I made them pay. That I laid out the numbers, watched them shrink, ordered the most expensive bottle, and left them the check. I understand that expectation. I've felt it myself. But here's what power actually looks like, the part I've learned from working with it every day. The strongest position in any room is not the one holding the biggest number. It's the one that no longer needs it. I had a career built with my own hands. Savings I earned through work, nights, and discipline. I did not need Nana's remainder to be free. And that, more than any inheritance, was what my mother could not tolerate understanding. So I closed the folder. Calmly. I gathered the pages back inside it, one by one. I set the pen they had brought for my surrender beside her plate, neatly, like something returned. I had already won the thing they thought they were negotiating before they ever sat down. Not through confrontation. Through preparation. Through seeing it clearly long before they did. There was nothing left to argue over. Only where I would spend the rest of my birthday. And I had already made that decision 6 months earlier in a quiet diner booth, when a nervous woman with my chin slid a photo album across the table and asked me for nothing at all. I administer estates for a living. And I always tell clients the same thing when they are being circled by people who only appear when there is something to gain. If they only show up when you are useful, you already know what they are. No shared history changes that. Not even family. Type the word boundaries below if you've had to learn that the hard way. And subscribe, because what happens next changes everything. I stood up. Just a simple rise from the chair. No performance. No scene. Just a woman leaving a table. But the effect at the front table was immediate. My mother's hands stayed suspended in the air where mine should have been. "Sit down," she said. The softness was gone. The control returned. A sharp, familiar edge reassembled itself in her voice. "Sit down, Paige. Where exactly do you think you're going?" Renee straightened. Brett stopped smirking for the first time all night. My father just looked exhausted, the expression of a man watching the last decent thing he inherited slip out of reach. I lifted the folder against my chest. And I looked at my mother, who had spent 25 years trying to convince me I didn't belong anywhere at all. "I'm going to my birth family," I said. "They're sitting 3 tables behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. It had been true the entire evening. True while she smiled. True while she strategized. True while she slid her waiver across the table. She thought she was performing my disownment for strangers. But she hadn't been performing it for strangers at all. She had been doing it within sight of the people who had been saving me a seat for 25 years. And I watched the words land. I watched my mother slowly turn in her chair, the way someone turns when part of them already knows the truth and is begging the rest not to confirm it. Cashmere's shoulders shifted. Her head turned. And there, at table 9, 3 tables back under warm light, were Susan, Pearl, and Danny. They had been there the entire time. Quiet. Steady. Watching. Susan met my mother's eyes first. No anger. No performance. Just recognition. Then she looked at me, and her entire face softened in a way that made the room feel different. Pearl sat like a verdict already decided, napkin folded, composed and still. Danny had stopped pretending his phone mattered. My mother's eyes moved between them and me, trying to reconcile what she was seeing. The resemblance. The alignment. The truth she hadn't accounted for. And I saw the exact moment it hit her. The family she said I didn't have had been sitting right behind her the entire time. Real people. Real presence. Real witnesses. She turned back toward me. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in my life, my mother had no script. And in that silence, a chair scraped back at table 9. They stood. All 3 of them. Not for drama. Not for confrontation. Just because I was coming to them. Pearl rose first, as she always does. Then Susan. Then Danny, nearly catching his knee on the table in his hurry. They didn't speak to my parents. They didn't need to. Their standing said everything. The room had gone quiet in that particular way strangers go quiet when they realize something real is happening in front of them. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray, and I walked. Past my mother still half-turned in her chair. Past Renee, who had finally run out of the word blood. Past my father, who looked up at me for a second, and then looked away again, choosing what he had always chosen. Comfort. One last time. 15 feet. 3 tables. 25 years. When I read it, Pearl took my face in both hands the way Nana used to, and Susan slid out the empty chair beside hers, the 4th chair, the one they had asked the host to add even though their reservation was only for 3. And she said the words she had written in that first letter, softened now from how many times I had read them. "We saved you a seat," she said. "We always did." And I sat in it. In the seat that had been waiting my entire life, at the table that had wanted me long before it knew if I would ever arrive. That was when my mother lost the only thing she had never lost in public. Control. I heard her chair scrape back. Heard her stand. Heard the composed front she had worn all evening fracture cleanly down the center. "After everything we paid for," she said, and it wasn't quiet anymore. It carried through the dining room, sharp and rising. "After everything we did for you, the schools, the roof, the years, you do this to us in public? You humiliate your family over money." Heads turned fully now. A man at the bar set his drink down. Renee was tugging at my mother's sleeve, hissing, "Diane, sit down. People are watching." But my mother was beyond even her own restraint for the first time in her life, because the script was gone. All she had left was what spilled out sideways. "We gave you everything," she said to a room full of strangers. And I noticed it immediately. She said gave, not loved. Even now, cornered, the word love never made it into the sentence, because it had never been in the accounting. I stayed seated at table 9. I didn't stand to meet her. I didn't raise my voice to match hers. Susan's hand found mine under the table, and I held it while I let my mother become loud. Because the loudness was doing the work for me. Every person in that room was watching the same thing, a calm young woman sitting quietly with people who clearly loved her, and an older woman unraveling about everything she had paid for. And no one, no matter how generous, hears a parent screaming about money and thinks, that's the real family. My father never stood. He just lowered his face into his hands. I let her run out of words the way a storm runs out of rain. And when the silence finally returned, I did one last thing before I gave my attention fully back to where it belonged. I stood up, walked the 3 tables back, and placed a single page on the white tablecloth in front of her. The trust distribution schedule. Face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals. But I wanted her to have something to read on the longest night of her life. "You can keep this," I said. "You'll want to understand what ended today. And what didn't." She stared at it. Wesley reached for it, then stopped halfway. I looked at both of them. My mother, who had once reduced me to a candle. My father, who had loved obedience more than truth. And I said the only sentence I had prepared in advance. The one I had formed in my head in the parking lot and decided I would only use if I earned it. "You kept me for the benefits," I said. "They kept a seat for me." Then I turned. And I walked back to table 9. I didn't look behind me. Not once. Not when Renee called my name. Not when my mother spoke again, words I couldn't hear and didn't want to. I sat down beside Susan. Pearl had ordered me a slice of chocolate cake while I was gone. Danny had stuck a single candle into it. Lit. And for a moment, the symmetry of it tightened something in my chest. Then Susan leaned in slightly and said, "Blow it out, sweetheart. Make your wish." And I realized I didn't have one. Because I already had it. The trust did exactly what my grandmother designed it to do. On my 25th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer ended exactly as Nana had notarized 2 years before she died. The remainder passed to me through a bank trustee. Untouched by the will my parents had spent years rewriting. Because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you do not control. Their waiver, unsigned, was worth exactly what it had always been worth. Nothing. Within a year, my parents sold the house on Linden Road. Without the distributions, they couldn't sustain it and moved somewhere smaller. I was told Renee was furious when she learned Nana's money would not be flowing to Brett either. The story spread the way these stories always do, through family first, then beyond it. And the version where Diane Mercer was the devoted mother wronged by an ungrateful adopted daughter never quite held up. Too many people had been at Fantaire. Too many had seen a woman shouting about money while a quiet girl sat holding hands with the family across the room. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't post anything. I simply stopped responding. And let silence become the boundary. The only one that ever truly holds. My father texted once, weeks later. 3 words. I am sorry. No name. No follow-up. I never replied. And never did again. I later heard that when Renee tried to rally the family to contest Nana's trust, it was Wesley who shut it down. He told them their mother had every right to leave her money where she chose. That it was hers. That it was finished. He was right. And, as always, he was late. Right in a way that changed nothing. That was my father in the end. A man who understood the correct thing, but only ever managed to say it after it no longer cost him anything. I didn't need the apology. But I'll admit I was glad he finally spoke it, even if too late to matter. As for me, I spent that first real birthday eating chocolate cake at table 9 with people who expected nothing in return for loving me. And I've spent every birthday since with them. Susan and I talk every Sunday now at 4, the hour I once reserved for Nana. Pearl taught me how to make her grilled cheese. Danny still sends memes like clockwork. And somewhere in a kitchen drawer in my new home, there's a photo album that no longer closes because it finally has enough life inside it. Being useful was all my parents ever wanted from me. Being wanted was something I had never known. And it took 25 years and one final dinner to understand the simplest truth of all. Anyone who only keeps you for the benefits has already told you everything you need to know. They were never your family. That's my story. One candle for 24 years. And on the 25th, a whole table that finally lit them all without being asked. If someone in your life only values you when you're useful, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You don't have to earn love that is real. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.